Every high-output person you admire had a period where they quietly disappeared. Newton isolated during the plague and invented calculus. Darwin spent years on a remote estate before publishing. And modern neuroscience now has a precise explanation for why that disappearance wasn't a coincidence. It was the mechanism. Cutting social input doesn't just free up time, it physically restructures your brain. This video is a protocol briefing. You're going to get 4 phases, each grounded in peer-reviewed neuroscience, that map exactly what happens to your brain during strategic isolation and how to engineer that process intentionally. By the end, you'll understand why most people spend entire careers running at 40% cognitive capacity and what a deliberate 6-month withdrawal cycle can do that no supplement, no morning routine, and no productivity app can replicate. Here's the problem most professionals never diagnose. Your brain is running 2 competing networks simultaneously: the task-positive network, which handles focused work, and the default mode network, which activates during social processing, self-referential thought, and relationship monitoring. Research from Stanford's Social Neuroscience Lab confirms these 2 networks are largely anti-correlated. When one is active, the other suppresses. In a life saturated with social input, meetings, messages, social media, ambient relationship maintenance, your default mode network is chronically overloaded. And that chronic overload doesn't just steal your afternoon. Over months, it degrades the structural connectivity of your prefrontal cortex, the seat of your judgment, long-range planning, and original thought. You're not distracted. You're architecturally compromised. Phase 1 is the default mode network reset, and it takes longer than you think. The first thing that happens when you reduce social input isn't clarity, it's withdrawal. MIT neuroscientist John Gabrielli's research shows the DMN requires approximately 14 to 21 days of reduced social stimulation before it begins down-regulating its chronic activation pattern. During that window, most people feel restless, understimulated, even anxious. They interpret this as evidence that isolation isn't working. It is working. That discomfort is your brain releasing its grip on social monitoring circuitry. The protocol for phase 1 is aggressive in its simplicity. For the first 3 weeks, you cut asynchronous social obligations by 80%. That means no social media consumption, no group chats beyond logistical necessity, and a hard cap on non-essential social commitments. You don't need to be a monk. You need to reduce the signal load enough for the DMN to begin its recalibration. By day 21, research participants in Gabrielli's studies showed measurable increases in sustained attention capacity, not because they worked harder, because they stopped fragmenting their neural architecture across a dozen social threads simultaneously. Here's what almost nobody talks about. The average professional receives 121 emails per day, 74 Slack messages, and checks their phone 96 times. That's not a distraction problem. That's a neurological architecture problem. Phase 2 is what neuroscientists call deep work myelination, and it's where the protocol starts producing output that shocks people. Myelin is the fatty sheath that wraps around neural pathways, and the more a pathway is used in focused, uninterrupted conditions, the thicker and faster that pathway becomes. Harvard neurologist George Bartzokis spent 2 decades studying myelin and concluded it is the single most underappreciated mechanism in human skill acquisition. Here's the critical detail. Myelination doesn't just accelerate with practice. It accelerates with uninterrupted practice. Fragmented sessions, the kind most professionals have every day, produce dramatically less myelination than the same total hours performed in deep, unbroken blocks. Phase 2 of the protocol, which begins around week 4 and runs through month 3, is the scheduled rebuilding of these deep work circuits. The structure is specific. 90-minute uninterrupted work blocks, performed at the same time each day, with a hard stop, no extensions, no creep. The consistency of the schedule matters as much as the depth. Your brain begins to anticipate the neurological state and enters it faster over time. A Stanford study on circadian cognitive performance confirmed that scheduling high-complexity work within your personal peak alertness window, typically a 3 to 4 hour band, produces output quality 2.4 times higher than work performed outside that window. Phase 2 is not about working more hours. It's about making every hour neurologically count. Consider this. Two professionals, same IQ, same hours worked. One fragments their day across meetings and messages. The other protects 3 deep blocks daily. After 6 months, their measurable cognitive output diverges by a factor researchers describe as career-defining. Phase 3 is the one most people skip, and skipping it is why their isolation eventually collapses or produces burnout instead of output. It's called identity restructuring, and it's grounded in research from the Max Planck Institute on self-concept and behavioral persistence. Here's the mechanism. Every habit and work pattern you carry is embedded in an identity, a story your brain tells about who you are in relation to your environment. Social environments are the primary reinforcement systems for that identity. Your colleagues, your social circle, your digital peers, they constantly reflect a version of you back at you. And that reflected version tends to be static. It's who you were when those relationships formed. When you reduce social input dramatically, that reflection disappears. And in its absence, your brain enters what researchers call an identity plasticity window, a period of heightened openness to self-concept revision. This is not mystical, it's neurochemical. Reduced social reinforcement lowers the activation of the brain's status monitoring circuitry, primarily the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which frees up resources for what psychologists call exploratory self-processing. In practical terms, Phase 3, running from month 3 to month 5, is when you use structured journaling and weekly review sessions to actively rewrite the behavioral scripts that your old social environment was maintaining. Not affirmations, not vision boards. Specific written protocols, what you are choosing, why, and what evidence is accumulating that confirms the new identity. This is how isolation becomes permanent behavioral change rather than a temporary performance spike. Ask yourself honestly, how much of what you do daily is actually your choice? And how much is behavioral residue from social environments you entered years ago and never consciously audited? Phase 4 is reintegration, and this is where the curiosity loop from the beginning of this video closes, because the bold claim wasn't that isolation makes you more productive in isolation. The claim was that it rewires your brain, and Phase 4 is the proof of that rewiring. Here's what the research actually shows about returning to full social engagement after a deliberate withdrawal cycle. A landmark study from the University of Toronto tracked professionals who completed structured periods of reduced social engagement, averaging 5.8 months, and compared their post-reintegration cognitive profiles to baseline. The results were unambiguous. Prefrontal cortex gray matter density had measurably increased. Default mode network reactivity to social stressors had decreased by an average of 31%. And crucially, the deep work capacity built during the isolation period did not regress when social life resumed. It persisted, because the neural pathways had been myelinated deeply enough to become structurally stable. Reintegration in Phase 4 is not passive. The protocol specifies a graduated return, one new social commitment per week, with a standing commitment to protect at least 2 deep work blocks per day as non-negotiable, regardless of social calendar pressure. The professionals in the Toronto study who followed structured reintegration maintained 78% of their isolation period output levels a full year later. Those who reintegrated without structure lost most of their gains within 60 days. The brain had been rewired, but rewiring requires maintenance architecture to hold. 6 months of isolation is not the destination, it is the construction phase. What you build during that window, if you build it correctly, does not disappear when you return to the world. It becomes the new baseline from which everything else operates. Here's the question worth sitting with, and drop your answer in the comments, because this genuinely changes the conversation. Which phase of this protocol do you think would be hardest for you personally? The DMN reset in week 1, the identity restructuring in month 3, or the reintegration discipline at the end? The answer tells you something specific about where your current behavioral architecture is most fragile. If this briefing was useful, the next video on this channel goes one level deeper. It covers the specific dopamine baseline reset that happens during the first 30 days of this protocol, and why most people accidentally sabotage it by making one very specific mistake on day 8. It's 9 minutes, same format, same standard. Subscribe, and it'll be the next thing waiting for you. Growth Daily, the research translated.